In this episode, we turn our attention to examine the impact of global warming and attendant climate change on developing countries and prospects for economic development. The fourth and fifth benchmark IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change Assessment reports, have really painted quite a dire picture for developing countries with respect to coming impacts already seen in terms of climate change. So there's other reports that have amplified their findings and concerns specifically related to various impacts on developing countries. A US NOAA study found there's already evidence of global warming on all of the indicators that they examined, and this was 10 years ago. The evidence has grown since then. In 2012 and 2013, the Turn Down the Heat reports showed the severity of likely consequences for developing countries unless there is strong action. The 2013 to 2014 fifth IPCC report showed even stronger impacts and evidence for impacts that the causes are human activity, and there are severe physical and social consequences with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, coming sooner than we once thought. So a series of major new reports are being released and more are being scheduled. You can find a lot of reports at the ipcc.ch website, but in particular the sixth IPCC assessments, these occur every 7 years, is now moving toward completion, and its various components will be published during 2021 and 2022. However, these reports, if we needed one, have been a wake-up alarm. I like to say the response has been to hit the snooze button to the alarm, but the IPCC, which represents the scientific consensus, has been warning of very severe consequences of global warming. Droughts, desertification, storms, floods, heat waves, deteriorated water resources, reduced crop yields, spread of pests and diseases, sea level rises, loss of grasslands and farmlands, and this is not a complete list. Fires, for example. Sub-Saharan Africa. In this region, countries are going to be disproportionately drought afflicted and suffer the worst impacts on agricultural productivity of any region. With respect to South and Southeast Asia, they will be disproportionately flood affected through both storms at sea and internal flooding problems. Pacific and Indian Ocean bordering states within the cyclone belt will also be disproportionately storm affected. And so some of the impacts worth looking at, really worth focusing on this and realizing the extent of the problems. Climate-induced spreading ranges of pests and diseases, such as those borne by mosquitoes. Prolonged droughts, indeed expanded desertification in Africa and elsewhere. Increased severity of storms, this comes with heavy flooding, very dangerous. Erosion, longer and more severe heat waves are predicted as a result. Reduced summer river flow in regions such as South Asia, and water shortages. Agriculture harmed in tropical and subtropical areas, notably much decreased grain yields in these areas. Lost groundwater and contaminated groundwater, deteriorated freshwater lakes, deteriorated coastal fisheries, mangroves, coastal reefs, coastal flooding, loss of essential species like pollinators, soil organisms, forest fires, crop fires, and resultant conflicts over natural resources may also increase in their number and magnitude, and there's already growing evidence for this. Described later in the text in section 14.5, I think that may be the wrong number, 14.5, I'll have something to say about it at the conclusion of this episode. In sum, the impact of global warming is likely hardest on the poor if you think about this overall pattern. I don't mean to paint such a gloomy picture There may be some reasons for optimism if we act, but I think that it's important to underline the severity of the potential impact this can have on economic development. Indeed, it's possibly the most serious threat that we have to successful economic development. There are other contenders. They may include, for example, conflict, but this is very much high on the list. So historically, most of the greenhouse gas emissions have been caused by the developed countries, not exclusively. Recently, also, there's growing sources of emissions from developing countries. So we can think about developing countries not just with respect to adaptation, but also having some role also in helping with mitigation. There's been rapid industrial growth, especially in Asia, particularly in East Asia, in particular development of coal plants, which have been major causes of greenhouse gas emissions, automobiles, and so on. This is often in developing countries been worsened by perverse policies. For example, fossil fuel subsidies, which are found to a surprising degree in different kinds of mechanisms in many countries in the world still today. Deforestation also in developing countries has been very dramatic for many years. It may account for 20% or even a little bit more of total greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide in this case. Strategies for mitigation include taxes on carbons, the famous carbon tax, very logical, difficult politically to enact, caps on greenhouse gases, generally with carbon markets, cap and trade situations, subsidies to include technological progress, with the idea that there is too little incentive for the market alone to develop these new technologies. Very recently, more of a focus on setting standards for controls on emissions and so on. A second best strategy, but it may be the most politically feasible strategy. And so types of adaptation, there's two main types. One is planned adaptation, sometimes called policy adaptation, in which government plays a central role. And the other is autonomous adaptation, as it is called. Reactions, responses for greater resilience and adaptation to impacts of climate change on the part of families, on the part of villages, and so on. And some of these types of autonomous adaptation are also reviewed in the textbook. So planned or policy-driven adaptation is undertaken by governments. Autonomous adaptation by individuals, families, communities. Let's take a look at some of those. If you're a farmer, altering your crop variety or your livestock variety, or indeed changing from agriculture to animal husbandry, changing livelihoods, increasing exploitation of common property resources or common pool goods, moving locally, such as to higher ground, migrating temporarily or permanently, either within a country or internationally. Almost certainly, in perspective, autonomous adaptation is going to be the predominant type of adaptation. Individuals are going to take the primary response, and that's especially true in developing countries where resources for policy are limited. But also planned or policy-based adaptation is an essential complement to this. So good governance acts as a complement for this autonomous adaptation. It should at least avoid thwarting beneficial responses on the part of the autonomous adaptation sphere. So these then can interact, autonomous and planned. So in terms of addressing vulnerable low-lying land that may be vulnerable long before the predicted sea level rise is experienced just through increased storm surges. So policies to vacate low-lying lands in densely populated areas subject to inundation can be beneficial, obviously, but it can also increase pressures on adjacent land and even raise conflict risks. In contrast, sometimes constructing barriers to protect low-lying land might avoid conflict. But then again, building such barriers can also have various unintended consequences, including environmental consequences in surrounding areas. Another example, policies restricting migration within or across countries that could avoid tensions and reduce conflict risks. But these restrictions could also increase risks themselves, because migration is a kind of safety valve, as it's sometimes called. It represents one of the most important forms of autonomous adaptation. Last, just a bit of a look ahead. I think it's right this time, section 14.5, adaptation in conflict. Some basic examples. Drawing down or contaminating neighboring wells as people look for other resources that they can use that are still viable. Out migration, but into already settled areas where conflict takes place. Pastoralists move and they may encroach on the area of other pastoralists, or they may encroach on areas that are being used by farmers for farming. Also, farmers may try to expand their territory, simply perhaps as a way of being able to still grow enough food. And in this case, they may be encroaching on traditional pastoralist lands. And so if you think about it, to some extent, this is a return to our Old West story, for example, about the farmers versus ranchers war as well. Some of these conflicts are still ongoing today, such as in sub-Saharan Africa. Communities may use neighboring common property, grazing lands, surface waters, and so on. This will not go unnoticed and can also lead to conflict. So these severe problems holding back opportunities for economic development, in this case, environmental damage and conflict, can be intertwined and unfortunately can be mutually reinforcing. So we'll continue to examine our analysis of environment and development in the next episode.